Let's finish with some opera of a different kind. A Yiddish poet, a Cuban baritone, an indigenous leader, part of a new opera playing this week in Havana. The work's been a long collaboration between a group of theatre producers and opera writers from the United States and a well-known Cuban musical troupe called Opera of the Street, bringing to life, in this case, an epic poem written in the 1930s by a Jewish immigrant to Cuba about the noble death of the island's indigenous chief at the hands of the Spanish. Will Grant puts it together for us.
The performers of Opera de la Calle warm up their vocal cords on stage. But some of these young Cuban singers aren't just running through their scales, they're also rehearsing their lines in another language, Yiddish.
I always wanted to write a Yiddish opera, but I didn't want to just write a shtetl opera, take a Shalom Aleichem story, write some klezmer music, blah, blah, blah. For some reason, I had other ideas.
Frank London composed this opera called Hatuey, Memory of Fire. It tells the story of the Taino chief who resisted the conquistadors and was burned at the stake in 1512. So where does the Jewish link come in? Frank London picks up the story about 10 years ago, drinking in New York with an old friend.
Somehow he mentions that his father-in-law, his wife's father, escaped the pogroms. His family in the Ukraine, they couldn't get into the U.S. at that point because of immigration restrictions against refugees. So he made it to Havana. He wrote a Yiddish poem about Hatuey, this famous Taino chief who led an uprising against the Spanish conquistadores and lost terribly and was martyred, and that he wrote this epic 100-page Yiddish poem. And I said, well, that's my opera.
That Ukrainian poet arrived in Havana as a refugee in the 1930s and took the name of Usher Penn at a time when many Jews were fleeing the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe between the two world wars. Usher Penn, who was also an engineer, became part of a thriving Jewish community in Cuba.
It was a big enough community that they had Yiddish, Spanish day schools. In fact, I briefly went to such a school when I was 4 years old, before we left Cuba when I was a little girl.
Ruth Bayer is a professor in anthropology at the University of Michigan. She's been instrumental in bringing people together for this production. As Cuban-American and Jewish, she has a background in both cultures.
They had a theater, they had the school, they had a Yiddish-Spanish newspaper, and then there were a few poets among them who wrote in Yiddish. And they wrote sometimes about Jewish topics, but sometimes about very, very Cuban topics, and that's what makes it so interesting.
With the subject of the opera now clear, there were still plenty of challenges to overcome. Elise Thoron had the complex task of writing the libretto.
The number of cultures involved, the indigenous culture of Hatuey, the Ukrainian poet who came to Cuba, having seen pogroms in his own country and found refuge here, and found this story of another devastation.
Composer Frank London says the key was to include the immigrant story of Usher Penn in the retelling of Hatuey's resistance to the Spanish.
We realized that if we made an opera of a bunch of Tainos, a bunch of indigenous, so-called Indians, on stage all singing Yiddish, it would be a bad Mel Brooks movie. People would go, what the heck? Why is this happening? But the minute you integrate the story of the guy himself,
right,
then everything makes sense. Why is he here? Why is he writing this poem?
So, rather than a straight Yiddish opera, it became a primarily Spanish one with some parts in Yiddish. Ulises Aquino, a well-known baritone in Cuba himself, is the director of the innovative Cuban troupe Opera de la Calle.
I'd be lying if I said it's been easy. It's been very difficult, mainly because we can't count on the technological means to transpose the different stories.
Ulises sees the work as part of the continuing cultural thaw between the US and Cuba, especially given the uncertainty since President Obama left office.
I think this is historic. Never before, including before the revolution, have we seen a collaboration of this kind between Cuban lyrical and musical theatre and North American musical theatre.
Director Ulises Aquino has a reputation for driving his performers especially hard, but this opening performance was spectacular. A really vibrant opera that sought to teach the audience, whether Cuban or Jewish or otherwise, about a culture they didn't know much about before.
Will Grant at the Opera in Havana. And that's it for World Update. Don't forget the podcast, the World Update Daily Commute. And join us for more World Update tomorrow.